Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Ensuring Partial Full Credit for Students Experiencing Homelessness. Please take a minute right now to make sure that you're muted. My name is Zach Stembo, and I'm the State Homeless Coordinator. I'm delighted to have you here today, and I'm excited to be joined by our guest speaker, Karen Rice from Schoolhouse Connection. Continuing on this webinar, you will see our accessibility features, our interpreter, and live captioning automatically on your screen. And we hope these features continue to improve your learning experience. Now I'm excited to introduce once again our guest speaker, Karen Rice. Karen is a renowned expert in the field of homeless education. She has extensive experience working with Schoolhouse Connection, a national organization dedicated to ensuring educational rights and opportunities for children and youth experiencing homelessness. Karen brings with her a wealth of knowledge about the McKinney-Vento Act and how that applies to students' school experiences. And I'm grateful she's joined us today to share her expertise to talk to us about partial credits for children and youth experiencing homelessness. During today's session, we'll provide an overview of the requirements under the McKinney-Vento Act to accept and award partial credits, including a discussion of best practices, transcript audit practices, and the role of the counselor in supporting students experiencing homelessness. Before we dive into content, I'd like to remind those of you who've been here and new people of expectations. The webinar is designed to be interactive and engaging. We encourage you to ask questions and share your thoughts. Participate in discussions throughout the session. We want this to be a collaborative learning experience for everyone, and to ensure a smooth operation, please be mindful of these norms. Today's video will be recorded for those who could not be present. Please ensure that your video feed is professional in nature and not distracting if you keep it on. Please keep your audio muted unless asking a question. Please use the hand-raising icon to gain the presenter's attention to ask a question. The chat function is available for question asking, and it will also be part of the recorded content. At the end of the webinar, a link will be added to the chat for you to complete to earn your ELA credit. That's E-I-L-A, ELA credit. You must stay to get that or email myself or Jennifer Watt for the link. I will be sending out links by request after this video renders. You must complete one form per video to earn each ELA credit. Thank you once again for joining us today. Now I'd like to invite Karen Rice to get us started. Karen?
Thanks, Zach. Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here with you today. Just give me 1 second while I get myself set up with sharing my screen with you. All right, hopefully that worked. Zach, can you see my screen?
Yes, it's great.
Perfect. Excellent. All right. Thank you very much for your patience. Sometimes I flip back and forth between so many different platforms that I can never remember how Teams and Zoom and all of the platforms work with sharing screens. So thanks for your patience. Well, I am delighted to be here with you again today to talk about awarding and accepting partial credits and full credits for children and youth experiencing homelessness. As Zach mentioned, I do work for Schoolhouse Connection, and you may have been on some of our webinars that we've done together so far, but if you haven't, just very briefly about our organization. We are a national nonprofit that provides advocacy and practical assistance from early childhood through higher education, state and federal policy advocacy, and sort of the jewel in our Schoolhouse Connection crown is our scholarship program. And I wanted to make sure to mention our scholarship program to you all today because our application is open. So we have a scholarship program that not only offers financial assistance for students, but it also provides case management through the transition from high school into post-secondary, whatever that post-secondary plan may be, and then throughout the course of our scholarship opportunity. So it's a really great opportunity for children and youth, youth, not children, who are headed into their post-secondary plans to apply for the scholarship. So if you have youth that you're working with that you think might be interested, information is on our website, and I'm happy to send that to Zach to share out with you all as well. Just wanted to make sure I mention that before we dive in. All right, so as we get started, I want to just kind of take a few minutes to set kind of our context and background of why we're talking about partial credits. So we know that our students experiencing homelessness face a lot of challenges with credits, with staying on track toward graduation, and just kind of the difficulty that mobility causes in making sure that students have what they need and are on track toward graduation when they're highly mobile and moving between schools or maybe moving between states. So we have some data on our website, and this is from a report that is living on our website. I believe that this data is old at this point, but it's what we've got. So I'm happy to share the link to this source, but with the data that we have, we know that only 67.8% of students experiencing homelessness graduate high school on time. That's well below the national average of 85.3%, and it's also well below the average for our economically disadvantaged or low income students who are housed, which is at 79.5%. So helping students graduate from high school prevents future homelessness. The single greatest risk factor for young adult homelessness is lack of a high school degree. So this is particularly important to make sure that our students are on track toward graduation and can get that high school diploma and move on to whatever is next for them. So I did want to share the graduation data for the state of Kentucky. So this is from data that Zach and his team had shared with me from the school year 2021-22. And so I think this is important to note just the difference in separating out data for our students experiencing homelessness. Now, it's a little bit misleading when you look at the bar graph because of the way that Google and PowerPoint set up their graphs when you put them in. It looks like the discrepancy is actually really quite large. So make sure you pay attention to those numbers on the sides. Just wanted to highlight that. So for all students, the graduation rate is just over 90%. For students experiencing homelessness, it's just under 86%. So it looks a little bit misleading in terms of just the graph itself. So wanted to just point out those numbers to you. But I think this really does show the importance of when you're looking at your data and you're really digging into what that data means for your students, it's really important to separate out the data for your students experiencing homelessness, even from your students who are economically disadvantaged. I know when I was the state coordinator, we had many times our data folks would say to us, well, we've lumped these students together. All of our economically disadvantaged students, including all of our highly mobile students, are kind of lumped together in this economically disadvantaged group because they're all automatically eligible for free and reduced lunch. So we just put them in this category. But when you really dig into the data, it really shows a difference for housed peers and non-housed peers. And so it's important to make sure that as we're thinking about graduation rates and we're thinking about how to keep students on track toward graduation, that we're really digging into that data. And we know, of course, that there are so many challenges for students who are accruing credits and trying to stay on track toward graduation. So students face challenges that can be in part due to frequent school transfers. So whether this is changing schools midterm before a credit has been awarded, or changes in curriculum or graduation requirements between schools or between states, it can really look different for students who are moving around a lot and who are highly mobile. Of course, we know that attendance and inconsistent attendance can be a challenge for students. And our students experiencing homelessness are chronically absent from school at a rate that's at least twice of our overall student population. And it's more than their low-income housed peers. So again, separating out that data, we know that attendance can be a really big challenge for students who are moving around or who are experiencing homelessness and trying to figure out where they're going to be. We know many times for students who move a lot, there may be a loss of their educational records. They may not be able to kind of keep track of them and bring them with as they're moving between schools, or they may have to leave them behind depending on their moving situation. We know that there can often be gaps in their records. Sometimes there's a lack of support and advocacy with the school that they're entering or leaving, or they don't know how to do that advocacy themselves. They don't know what their options are or what rights they have under McKinney-Vento. And of course, we know that anxiety, trauma, mental health, physical health challenges are all part of homelessness. And so adding all of that up can really make it difficult for students when they're thinking about also trying to figure out their credits and their graduation and how all of that works. It kind of just compiles on to the stress and anxiety that they're already facing because of their homelessness. So what are the benefits to ensuring that our students are receiving these credits? And I say partial credit a lot, but I want to also kind of put the caveat around that of it could also be full credits. So depending on kind of how it plays out and what your district processes are, it could be partial or full credit. So I just kind of want to put that caveat out there as we're talking about this. But benefits to ensuring that students are receiving credit. Of course, we want to make sure that we're not penalizing our students for transferring schools or for having to change schools because of their homelessness. So a student experiencing homelessness should not have their living situation be something that's affecting their high school graduation and that's penalizing them for that. We do not want students to have to repeat coursework that they've already completed. I cannot think of a way to help to cause our students to disengage more in school than having them have to repeat the same class over and over and over again. We also want to make sure that we're creating room in students' schedules for classes that they either need to take for graduation or that are of interest to them, or that's something they're thinking about for a future after high school, a class that may give them some skills that they can use in the future. So we want to make sure that we're also providing space for students to have those opportunities. And of course, we want to be thinking about our graduation rates and making sure that our students experiencing homelessness are also graduating. Okay, so what does the law require? Unfortunately, the law is a little bit vague when it comes to the actual process and procedure for how to award partial credits. So as Zach mentioned, I'm going to share some best practices and strategies with you today, but these are the requirements that McKinney-Vento does lay out for awarding and accepting partial credits. So first and foremost, liaisons must ensure that students experiencing homelessness receive appropriate credit for full or partial coursework that's satisfactorily completed while attending a prior school. So students that are coming to your school from another school, we want to be reviewing their information and making sure that they have partial credits if they left mid-semester or if they left mid-quarter or whatever that looks like. We want to make sure that we're reviewing that information because the law does require that we are looking for those full and partial credits. We also want to point out that there's an emphasis on making sure that we're really putting forth these efforts in implementing for unaccompanied youth. So our youth that are not under the care of a parent or legal guardian, they might not have someone advocating for them, or they might not know what their rights are for full and partial credit. So it's important to remember that the law requires that special emphasis on implementing this for unaccompanied youth. And so schools must work with their prior school to calculate, award, and receive partial credits and make any adjustments necessary to the student's schedule to permit courses to be completed or to have credit recovery opportunities. So again, these are the requirements under the law, under McKinney-Vento. And so I wanted to also talk about what is in the law in Kentucky. So I believe we talked about this in one of our first webinars together, but just wanted to emphasize House Bill 378 that was passed in 2019 requires LEAs to do the following: to adopt written procedures to ensure partial credit is awarded to students experiencing homelessness, to provide opportunities for credit accrual, eliminating those barriers, whether they're academic or non-academic. We want to make sure that we're eliminating barriers, and then providing access to extracurricular programs, summer programs, online courses, after-school tutoring, whatever it is that students need to be awarded those partial credits. So I would love to hear from you in the chat of how you're implementing this. I know as a former state coordinator in Wisconsin, we had every district that I talked to was doing this in a really different way. So they knew what they were required to do under McKinney-Vento, but it just looked really different with everyone that I talked to. So if you are interested in sharing in the chat, I would love to hear from you how you are implementing these written procedures and how you're implementing the requirements in Kentucky. All right, so when we think about credits, I want to offer these important considerations. First and foremost, what is fair is not always equal or the same. So we do want to make sure that we have procedures, and those procedures are important to have a plan and to have something laid out, but it's also really important to be considering how we can be flexible for equity's sake. So what works for one student might not work for the other. Students come from all different backgrounds, from all different experiences, and we really want to make sure that we're looking at what's in the best interest of that particular student. So it might look a little different than a peer or someone else coming into the school. So we just want to consider that sometimes being flexible for equity's sake is really important for our students. Again, we want to make sure that we're addressing barriers that are faced by our students. And the laws that we have really support that innovation and advocacy for students and changing procedures that are no longer working. So we don't have to do things how we've always done them. We can consider new ways, we can consider innovative ways to really support this work and to really support our students when we're thinking about partial credits. Okay, so I'm going to offer you some steps on how to do this. We're going to start out with talking about immediate enrollment, which of course is a requirement under McKinney-Vento. But then I'm going to offer some strategies and best practices with calculating and awarding partial credits and then accepting partial credits. Again, partial and full credits as appropriate. Okay, so starting out, I want to say that while we are going to talk about best practices, step one is immediate enrollment, and this is required in the law. So we know that under McKinney-Vento, we have to enroll our students immediately, even if they don't have those school records with them. They might be missing school records, they might be missing other documentation, but we have to get our students enrolled immediately. We also want to immediately request records from their previous schools. And one thing that we can do, because we know that students who move in the middle of either a semester or a quarter or a marking period, they might not come with that actual credit on their transcript. So we can request checkout grades or partial credits and kind of see where they were at as they were leaving and kind of what their grade was at the point where they had to leave and move to a new school. If that information is missing from their records, one strategy that I would highly recommend is reaching out and contacting the liaison in the district where they're coming from. Now, if the student wasn't identified at that point under McKinney-Vento, the liaison might not have that information readily available to them. However, if you reach out to the liaison, they're often a great advocate for getting that information and helping to provide that support. So sometimes calling another school, you kind of get lost in, automated phone land of who can I talk to and who can I reach out to, and I'm not sure who the best person to talk to, whether it's the enrollment person or a counseling person. And so sometimes starting with the liaison is a really great way to kind of make that initial connection, and they can help provide that support to get what's missing and to get that information to send to your school.
Karen, can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
When you say immediately request the records, is that something from the law, or is that a best practice that you're saying?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that is not in McKinney-Vento. However, I know that there are a number of states that have requirements in state statute about immediately requesting records and kind of what that time frame is. So for example, in Wisconsin, we have in our state statutes of what that time frame looks like, of how long the districts have to request those records and to send those records. And so the point of emphasis there is don't wait 6 months to request the records to find out what classes the student was in. The sooner you can get those records, and if you can get them right away, it can help figure out the best placement for that student and the best classes to make sure that they're in enrolling. So immediately requesting records is not in the law, but I would say that it's still important to do that as soon as possible to make sure our students are in the right place for what classes they're taking. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes sense. I was just asking, and I appreciate the answer for the clarification. Thanks.
Perfect. Yep. Anytime. And I'm happy to answer any questions. If you've got them, feel free to drop them in the chat. So I'm happy to pause for questions anytime. Okay, so we want to make sure that we're talking with students when we enroll them. Again, this is a best practice, not a requirement, but I highly recommend holding enrollment appointments with students when they come to enroll. this is a really great opportunity to speak with them about what courses they were in, because of course we know that even if we request records immediately, we're not going to have them immediately. So I could reach out the same day to another school and say, hey, I need the student's records. It might take a little bit of time for me to get those. So if we can talk directly with the student, this is a way to figure out what classes that student was in, what previous classes they might have had. And it really kind of helps in the process of putting together a schedule for that student so that they can be in the classes that are most appropriate based on the information they're given. And so thinking through if they don't have records, or again, if you're waiting for records from school, talk to our students, talk to our youth. That's a great way to kind of find out where they were at. We also want to make sure we're reviewing any records and information, putting students in equivalent classes. So as we're talking to students, as we're looking at those records and reviewing that information, we want to try to be as equivalent and comparable as possible with the classes that we're putting them in. So if a student was in an algebra class, for example, we want to find a comparable algebra class that they can continue in, so they're not starting over in a class that they might have already taken or jumping ahead to a class that they're not ready for. So thinking through what might be equivalent or what might be comparable for placing students in classes. And so if an equivalent class is not available, students definitely should have options if they're available in your district. So instead of just kind of, okay, well, we don't have something comparable, we don't know what to do, we'll just kind of put you in the same class or put you in a different class that might not be the right fit. We want to think through what other options might be available. So is there online coursework that they can do to complete a class? Are there packets that students can do to complete a class? Again, all with that goal in mind of what kind of partial or full credit can we give to that student for the coursework they've already done. So they're not starting over, so they're not in a class that they're not ready for. So thinking through what those other options might be, and that's going to look different in every district. So again, just kind of thinking through what options you might have for completing some of that work. Okay, so continuing on along this enrollment and kind of class placement line, we want to make sure that in the absence of records, we're enrolling students based on graduation requirements and age equivalent grade courses. So I think this one is particularly important when we have students coming in from other countries, for example, and the education systems don't match up. And so if we have a student who's coming in who's maybe 10th grade age, but doesn't have records or maybe hasn't attended for a while in their home country, we want to look at that student and say, okay, you're an age equivalent for 10th grade. Let's put you in 10th grade classes and kind of figure this out moving forward. We want to look at graduation requirements, how we can recoup those credits, what other options we might have for credit recovery. But let's not take a student who's maybe 16 or 17 and put them in freshman classes if we can avoid it. So we want to be thinking through kind of without any records or without any information, how can we kind of keep that grade equivalent and age equivalent so students are still, again, on track with their peers. It's important to provide teachers with transfer grades if you're able to get them. Also, it's a great idea to allow students to kind of start fresh on their first day in class. So even if you can get those grades and provide them to teachers, if a student was not doing very well in a class, we don't want to penalize them for their mobility and moving and transferring into a new school. So it's a great idea to work with teachers to just kind of give students a fresh start. So here's what the paperwork says, here's what the information says, but let's really give students an opportunity, knowing that they have support through McKinney-Vento and through the homeless liaison, that we can hopefully try to give that student an opportunity to kind of start over in that class. And of course, yep, go ahead.
We have one hand raised.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, please. I can't always see the hands raised when I have screen sharing, so I'm sorry. I was not ignoring you. Please go ahead.
I'm sorry. I think it's I can't see the first name.
It's Mark.
Hey,
Zach. Hey, Karen, can you elaborate or maybe talk best practice about, so when let's see, when newcomers are arriving at our schools, and you mentioned if there's 16, place them in those those grades that are relevant to a 16-year-old. But can you elaborate or give some best practice to what would be some best practice things to do with our newcomers, our EL students that are coming to our country that don't speak English, may not have the same skill sets because of the education they've received in their prior country? What could we do? What should we be doing to try to meet their needs? But at the same time, our high schools are under a lot of pressure for student achievement, and obviously those students, no fault of their own, we're only given 1 year for them to master English and then take assessments and supposedly score at the same level as someone that is a fluent speaker. So could you maybe speak to best ways to handle those situations?
Yeah, absolutely. And we are going to talk at our next webinar more about supporting immigrant and migrant students. So some of my responses I will save for our next webinar together. But this is a really great point to be partnering with the EL staff in your district. So having that collaborative relationship between the liaison and EL staff is going to be really important, because you're absolutely right. You don't want to put a student in an algebra class or a geometry class or a chemistry class where the academic language is just beyond where they're at in that moment. And so placing students in ESL classes or co-taught classes will be really important to make sure that you're also meeting student needs. So that's why this is kind of a recommendation in terms of some of those students, because we know that our students who are coming in who are English learners and who might not have been in schools in the US before, we need to also kind of consider that differently, I think, than this, because we want to make sure that we're working with our EL staff to appropriately address their needs. And so I can tell you that I worked with our newcomer and our immigrant students when I was a liaison in a district, and we tried to very intentionally place those students with their peers so that we didn't have a 16-year-old who was in class with 14-year-old freshmen feeling like, oh my gosh, I'm in this class with all these younger kids, and I just want to connect with my peers who are similar in age and have kind of some of the similar experiences than I do. So we tried to be really intentional about placing them age appropriately, but again, in partnership with our EL team, to put them in classes where there were bilingual teachers or there were other kids who spoke the same language, where they had support from the EL teachers coming into class, things like that. So that partnership and that collaborative relationship with your EL or multilingual, I know it's called different things in different districts, but your EL or your multilingual staff will really be key partners in kind of figuring out how to best meet those needs of students. So some of this we'll talk more about at our next webinar together when we talk about supporting immigrant and migrant students. But that's a really great question. And I would say definitely connect with those people in your district, with your EL and multilingual staff, to talk through kind of what the best way to do that is. All right, and Zach, please feel free to interrupt me again. Like I said, I can't see all the hands raised when I'm sharing my screen, so I welcome any interruption and any questions, and thank you for that. That was an excellent question. Okay, okay, I lost my train of thought, but now I'll start here. So checking back with students after a couple of weeks is going to be important. I think this is a great strategy. So when we're placing students in classes and we're thinking through, okay, we talked about what classes you were in, we kind of looked at where you were at, we talked about what's comparable. Instead of sending students like, okay, great, now go and do your classes and good luck and be successful and we're here if you need us. Instead of kind of sending students off to do that, those check-in points are going to be really important. And so we want to make sure that we're following up with our students and that we are checking back to make sure that the placements are appropriate. So we may send students off into a class that we believe is sort of equivalent or is the best fit in that time with the information that we have. But when we receive the records, we might find out, oh, the student actually already did this class and they're actually now in a duplicate class that they don't need. it's okay to go back in a few weeks and make adjustments for those students. We want to make sure we're not penalizing them for those adjustments, but it's okay to do that so that our students are not having to take the same classes, or again, not in a class that's beyond where they were at, that's maybe too hard or not at the level they were at in that particular subject area. So thinking about kind of what happens when we receive those records and checking in with students, I think will be a really, really critical step to this. Okay, so let's jump into talking about calculating and awarding partial credit. So partial credits can be entered manually on a student's transcript, or they can be done through a student information system process. I know that looks different. Every district that I've ever talked to has kind of a different process for how those credits show up on the transcript. So it's important to make sure you know what that looks like. So whether you have to enter those partial credits manually, whether you talk to your student information system administrator on how to do that, whatever that looks like, it's a good idea to know kind of what that process is. So we want to make sure that if a student is unable to enroll in an equivalent course at a new school, that we are looking at those partial credits from the coursework that they were already completed, in their prior school. I keep using math as an example because that's always the class that kind of pops into my head. But of course, it can be any class. So if a student has completed half of an Algebra 1 class and they're placed in an Algebra 2 class, we want to go back and look at, okay, they did a quarter's worth of Algebra 1. They maybe didn't finish the semester, but they did a quarter's worth. Can we award a quarter credit? Can we award a half credit? What can we give that student for that chunk of time that they were in that Algebra 1 class? And there's a lot of different ways to kind of figure out how to make up that quarter, and we're going to talk more about that. But really looking at, we don't want that student to have to go back. If they're in an Algebra 2 class and they're being successful and that's an appropriate placement, we don't want them to go back and have to do one more quarter of an Algebra 1 class or start over in an Algebra 1 class. So we really want to think about, as our students are on track toward graduation, what can we do to kind of fill in the gaps of some of those partial credits that might be missing? Of course, it's important to say that we're not just kind of willy-nilly awarding these partial credits, right? That we want to have some kind of clear basis for that calculation, whether we're looking at attendance or grades or other strategies that we're talking about. We want to make sure that we have a process and a system to do that. So I just want to say that I'm not suggesting just kind of look at a transcript and make something up, that we really do want to have some kind of clear basis for how we're calculating that out. Now, as I said before, flexibility is important. And so it's okay to have procedures that are like, if this, then this, and if this, then this. We want to allow for flexibility, but we also want to have a clear basis for that calculation. We want to be able to show what it is that we've done and how we figured that out to put that partial credit on the transcript. Okay, again, these are suggestions, not requirements for awarding partial credit, but just wanted to talk through using partial credit calculation formulas as a guide is a great way to do this. Again, thinking through, sometimes we might need to be flexible, or we might need to try something different and not use the same system that we've always done, thinking through innovation and equitable practices for our students. We want to use professional judgment, of course. We want to think about the best interest of the student, but use our professional judgment. So we don't want to place a student and say, okay, you weren't doing so great in Algebra 1, and it seems like you were really struggling, and we've got some notes from the teacher that it was not going well, but you were there and you were sitting in class, and so fine, we'll just put you in Algebra 2. Of course, we don't want to do that. If the student is struggling and struggled through that Algebra 1 class, maybe they do need to go back, or maybe they do need some additional support for that content material. So of course, we want to be always using our professional judgment. And Mark, you asked a great question in the chat. If assessment data shows they've not yet mastered standards in Algebra 1, why award partial credit if they don't have the capacity to move forward? You're 100% right. So we don't want to place students in class that are in a class that's not appropriate for them. As someone who has always been terrible at math, if you would have placed me in an Algebra 2 class without my finishing Algebra 1, it would have been completely beyond me, and I would have been not successful at all in Algebra 2. So we want to be looking at that, and looking at that assessment data is also a great way to figure out the appropriate class to put that student in. So that's a great question. So I'm not saying skip over something that a student might have been struggling in just because they were there in class. I'm saying if it's appropriate and it seems like, you know, maybe a student takes kind of a comprehensive final exam or something and can show mastery in that class, that maybe then that's the opportunity for partial credit. But yeah, it's not just like, okay, you were there and you struggled, but we'll put you in this other class. We want to really find what that appropriate class is for the student. That's a great question. Thanks for asking that. I do want to caution you to be aware of seat time. I know some states have seat time requirements and some do not. So if seat time is not a district requirement for all students, it shouldn't be a requirement for students experiencing homelessness. If it is a district requirement for all students, it can be used to inform the amount of partial credits, but we do want to keep in mind that McKinney-Vento requires that tardies and absences and missed seat time due to homelessness and due to a student's homeless status can't be a barrier to that student, can't be held against that student. So just a caution about seat time requirements. Again, some places have requirements around that or not. We don't want to make that a requirement for our students experiencing homelessness if it's not a requirement for everyone else. One option that I just mentioned is that we can award credits by exams. So again, thinking through if a student takes a final exam in Algebra 1, let's say a student moves in right near the end of Algebra 1 and takes that exam, maybe they didn't complete the coursework, but let's say they get 100% on their algebra exam. That's probably a good indication to us that they are ready to move on to Algebra 2, and we can award that partial credit for the time that they were in that class in whatever school they were at before. So sometimes those tests, different tests, which mentioned in the slide, I won't read them all to you, but sometimes that's a way that we can also figure out kind of mastery for that student and what might be appropriate and how we can kind of use what we learned from that to award partial credits. Okay, again, thinking through other options for awarding partial credits. These are, again, strategies and best practices, but thinking through work experience or community service, that might be a great way to help meet some of those partial credit requirements. So for example, I had a student that I worked with for quite a while, and he came in to enroll in our school and had been to multiple different schools before he came to us. But one thing that was really constant and consistent for this student was that he was working as an auto mechanic apprentice. He had gotten a job in a community, a neighboring community, where he was living at one point, and they were kind of helping to train him and preparing him for going to auto tech school after high school and then coming back to work for them full time. And this was something the student had set up completely separate from any of his academic experiences. And so when he came into our district, he was credit deficient, and we were trying to think of options of how we could award partial credits for the student. And so we looked at this really amazing apprenticeship opportunity that he had, and we figured out how to use some of that work experience apprenticeship thing that he had set up all on his own, completely separate from school. And we used some of that to award some partial credits for him in some of his elective areas that he needed some extra credits. So it was something that we tried that we had never done with a student before. So just kind of thinking through, again, those outside of the box ideas of how can you really meet student needs kind of based on some of those additional things that they're doing. Of course, thinking through project-based learning, portfolios, independent study projects that can show competency in an area is a way to kind of look back and see about awarding partial credits. And mastery of skills. And so we talked about this, but of course we want to make sure that we're placing students in classes that are appropriate and making sure that they've mastered the content. So we're not talking about just kind of, okay, great, here are partial credits for things, but we do want them to have mastered the skills. We just don't want to have students finding themselves in classes where they've already taken and they've already passed, or they're duplicating their work. Okay, I think we're going to talk about this slide just very briefly. This is a strategy that a counselor that one of my team members worked with suggested, but looking for opportunities to award multiple credits where it's justified. So this example that this counselor gave was a student who completed a food science and safety course. In their district, they were able to grant both a vocational and a lab science credit to the student. Now I have not heard of this in many other places of being able to award these multiple credits, but it is an option and it did work for this particular counselor who shared that. So I wanted to just offer that as a suggestion of something to consider. Again, just being open to alternative options, using common sense, working with the student, and just figuring out what's in the best interest of the student and the best placement for that student. We want to, again, be looking back at work that the student has done and thinking outside the box and really considering how we can calculate and award partial credits that might be missing. Okay. So when we think about awarding partial credits, we want to provide, if we can, and sometimes this is not a perfect system between the sending school and the receiving school, but if we can, as the sending school, we want to provide the receiving school with information that it needs to give students the credits they've earned. So if we know that our students are going to be transferring states or schools, providing that information to the school where they're going is going to be really important. Again, working with either a registrar or a database manager to make sure those partial credits are on their transcripts is going to be crucial. So we can talk about awarding partial credits all we want, but if they're not showing up on the transcript, it's not really helping the student at all. So making sure we kind of know what that process is and how that looks. And then again, making sure that we're including information as quickly as possible for the receiving school. And it's a great opportunity for liaisons to partner and for liaisons to connect with each other to kind of be that main point of contact. Providing students with copies of their transcripts, whether the official or unofficial copy, is also a great idea for students to be able to bring those with them to show either their counselor or the liaison or whoever it is that's supporting their enrollment. So that's one way to kind of help with facilitate and navigate some of that. While we're waiting for records, we've got this information from the student that the student brings with them. Of course, we don't always know that our students are moving to new schools or that they'll be entering new schools. We don't always know when our students will find themselves in situations where they have to be highly mobile and moving around a lot. And so this is, of course, not a perfect system with kind of how that plays out with all students. But as we're able, these are some practices that we can use. Just a note about, we talked about this a little bit when Mark asked his question, but awarding credits to students coming from other countries. Again, enlisting the help of our EL coordinators and teachers to determine equivalent courses, credit types, things like that. When I was working with students, we had a student that I worked with that came from Mexico, and we did a lot of digging to find out kind of what the student's GPA was, what the equivalent was, because of course in Mexico they use a different system. And we really wanted to try to figure out kind of where those equivalent pieces were so that we could help and support that student to the best way possible. So we can think about partial credits in terms of if that student successfully completes a first year of secondary school in their home country, we can think about awarding 9th grade credits the average peer in the US would have earned, something like that. And so just, again, another strategy to think through as you're thinking about students that are coming into your district. And of course, our time is flying, so I'm going to keep going and try to go quickly through these next couple of slides because I do want to share a case study with you that I had an opportunity to be a part of. So accepting partial credits, we want to make sure first and foremost that if we're the receiving school, we're honoring and accepting the partial credits from the sending school. So even if there's not an equivalent for it, or it doesn't really match up with our credit scale or our own graduation requirements, we want to make sure that we're honoring what that sending school has provided on the transcript. There are some partial credit calculators that states like California and Washington have, and those are great tools. I linked them into these slides, so you'll have access to these slides, and just wanted to offer those as an additional resource to take a look at. So we want to make sure, one point of emphasis on this slide is we want to make sure we're not adding additional requirements or criteria for the partial credits awarded by the prior school. So we don't want to have students come to our schools who have to take additional exams or assessments or show proof of work if the prior school has already awarded that partial credit. So we're accepting that transcript and that partial credit, in good faith that they've reviewed the information and they've done what's appropriate for that student's education. Okay, I'm going to go quickly through this one too. We want to make sure we're applying credits as possible toward the requirement they were intended to meet. So I once talked to a school who said, well, if we are awarding partial credits to students, we just dump those all into electives, and that's just kind of how we navigate it. And I pushed back on that and said, well, that's great, but students don't need unlimited electives. So can we really look and be intentional about if it's a math credit to somehow give a partial math credit, or to try to figure out kind of what some of those equivalents were instead of just putting those partial credits into the elective area. So just want to kind of give you a heads up about that. And I know that happens. And again, this is an imperfect system, and it would be fantastic if McKinney-Vento spelled out exactly how to do this. So again, just kind of offering these as strategies and lessons that I've learned over the years. One other thing that I want to highlight on this slide, and you can read the rest of these for yourself as you have time and as you have access to the slides, but thinking about pass-fail grades for students is also a way to kind of navigate some of those. We don't know what letter grade to give. We don't want to give a student an A when we're not sure that that's what they would have earned. And so thinking through how pass-fail grades could be used on a transcript is also an option, and also kind of a way to navigate some of these. Okay, so I want to very quickly just talk about gaps in enrollment, because when we think about partial credits, we kind of assume that the student is coming directly from their prior school, which we know is not always the case. So if we have a student who starts the year at school A and then leaves that school A in October, but doesn't enroll into another school, school B, until February, we don't want to just go back and say that student completed that whole semester's worth of coursework or whatever it is. We want to really go back and look at, okay, we want to review when the student was there through October. Let's look at the student's attendance and grades, and maybe we can give a partial credit, or maybe we can use some of that coursework to drive what the student is going to do now in February entering school B. But again, this is why connecting with the liaison will be so important from the prior school, to make sure, because we know there are gaps, and we're not saying students should be awarded credits for not being in school, but we also don't want to be penalizing our students who are highly mobile and maybe moving around a lot, and maybe out of school because of their homelessness. So just wanted to mention that briefly. And then I want to take just a quick minute to talk to you about this. I'm calling it a case study for lack of a better term for it. Schoolhouse Connection had the opportunity to partner with Rome City School District in New York. And by Schoolhouse Connection, I mean it was mostly me that was partnering with them. And so I had a great opportunity to work with them and kind of try some things out. So we sat down together and really reviewed and dug into their graduation data and what their requirements are. And I will say the state of New York is very unique in that they have a very extensive guide to graduation. And so we tried to dig into all of those pieces of what those requirements were. And then we took a look at their graduation worksheet that they had. It's something that the counselor completes for all students to go through classes and credits and kind of look for those partial credit opportunities. So we took all of the information that we had and the data that we reviewed, and we kind of revised and updated their graduation worksheet. Then with all of that information and a focus on McKinney-Vento, we sat down to develop some district and state-specific, using the state-specific guidance, but some district guidance for their counseling staff. And we developed an audit template for them. And again, I've linked in those as a sample for you, so you'll have access to those. Also in the state of New York, the principal is the only person who can approve and sign off on partial credits. So we developed a communication tool for requesting that partial credit approval with the principal. So once we had all of those tools done, we met with the counseling team. So this particular school district has 6 counselors at their high school level. And so we sat down with the counseling staff and kind of trained them on all of this. We talked through McKinney-Vento and requirements. We talked through partial credits. We talked through the guidance that we provided based on the information that we had and practices that the district used. And then we asked the counseling staff to conduct transcript audits for all of their students identified under McKinney-Vento. Now, I do want to say this seems a little bit overwhelming because many larger school districts with multiple high schools and large numbers of students may not have the opportunity to do this. This particular school district had approximately 50 students identified at the high school level, so it was pretty small with 6 counselors. So we kind of divided that up and asked the counseling team over the course of 2 months to do a really in-depth transcript audit on all of their McKinney-Vento students. Once they had done that, we got back together and we kind of debriefed that audit. We looked at data, we looked at their highly mobile students and awarding partial credits and what partial credits they found and how they calculated those. And it was a really unique opportunity to dig in with the counselors to what that looks like. Now, I do want to say in the end, because of the way the school district kind of just has their student population right now, they did not have a lot of students moving into their school during this particular school year. So the students that had been there had primarily been in the district for most of their high school experience. So we didn't find a lot of partial credit opportunities. So I want to just be transparent about that. But we did talk about processes for doing that. And we did find a couple of places where the counselors felt like they could request partial credits for some students based on some of the work that they've done. And so we were able to request those. And we actually had an opportunity to meet with the principal and talk a little bit more about this process. And their plan is to take what they've learned and to take what they did as part of this process and to scale it up for their other highly mobile student population. So thinking through when they have students moving in and out for other reasons, they have some students who kind of come and go, students that are in juvenile detention facilities that are in their district for a short time. They want to think about how they can use this for those other highly mobile student populations to really dig in and look for those partial credits and really focus on graduation. Their graduation data, I don't remember the exact number, but it was not very good for their highly mobile student populations and specifically their students experiencing homelessness. So they really wanted to be intentional about, let's make sure we know what to do and let's make sure we focus on our students experiencing homelessness and then talk about how we can kind of scale that up for other students. So one of the reasons that we had them do a transcript audit is because we really felt like this was a dropout prevention strategy. So we know there are only so many exits off the highway, right? When we think about graduation, there's only so many ways to get to graduation and so many opportunities for those graduation cohorts. We wanted to focus on helping students to understand their credits, support them in earning credits, and then also to just give them hope that they were on track. We know that students who fall behind in 9th grade will likely continue to be behind throughout their high school career. And if they can't see that progress toward graduation, they are more likely to drop out and to not finish. So looking at data was a really intentional piece of this. But then also with these transcript audits, the counselors met with each student to look at their credits as a way to connect and engage with their students, not only to help keep them on track toward graduation, but also then as an opportunity to say, hey, I see you're doing really great in this particular track. This is the way their high school is set up. So I know that it's different other places, but I see that you're doing really well in this track. Have you thought about post-secondary plans, kind of looking at this? You're on track to graduate. Let's talk about what you could do after school. And let's talk about FAFSA and let's talk about those college applications. So they kind of use these audits as a guide to get them to additional conversations and thinking about post-secondary planning. So some of the key takeaways and best practices that I learned and that we learned together as we were doing this work is that now there's a process so that anytime a student enters into their school district, the counselor is going to immediately look at all previous coursework to review it for opportunities to award partial credit. So that's kind of their new plan, their new procedure that they have. If they have new students come in, they're going to do that first to look for those opportunities. They also have a plan that they'll hopefully be able to do to be reviewing their transcripts every year, their students experiencing homelessness, to look for those partial credit opportunities and to ensure that students are on track for graduation. They're going to continue to use the transcript audit process for their students experiencing homelessness, as well as others who are highly mobile. And they really wanted to have focus on having a collaborative relationship with the homeless liaison. So the homeless liaison recognizes the counselor's specific responsibilities in supporting students identified under McKinney-Vento in terms of their post-secondary plans, their FAFSA, and supporting kind of that process. And so they wanted to really work on improving that collaboration between the liaison and the counselors so that they could really focus on making sure their students were on track toward graduation. And so, as I mentioned, this was also an opportunity for them to check on students' plans for after graduation and really provide that extra support for students. So those are the best practices and kind of key takeaways that we had from that work. We have about 5 minutes, so my apologies that we don't have more time, but just want to open it up for any questions that you might have.
I want to ask if Jennifer will drop the link into the chat and remind people to take their exit ticket for their ELA credit before they leave. Thank you, Jennifer. And I want to thank you, Karen. This has been so helpful. I know that so many people want to do so well with this, and this has been just incredibly helpful for liaisons. So thank you very much. And if anybody has questions, we have a few minutes. Jennifer and I are actually on a monitoring visit. We're in Western Kentucky, and when we leave here, we're going to get to meet a liaison. So we don't have as long to stay after today, but we have a couple minutes.
I guess we've solved all the problems of the world here.
If you don't have a robust partial credit policy, now's your time to ask.
And I certainly hope that you'll take into consideration some of these ideas, again, the strategies and best practices that we've heard and learned, and think about how you can incorporate that into your practices and your policies and your procedures. And hopefully you'll be able to use some of these tips from others in thinking through and how to do that in your district.
I would just say that each partial credit policy should really be, or I'll ask, would you agree with the statement that each partial credit policy should be unique in each district?
I absolutely would agree with that, because graduation requirements look different, communities look different, schools look different. You know, even if, again, I'm in Wisconsin and we have standards, state standards, of course, for graduation, but that still looks different in every school district and how it's implemented in every school district. And so we're all working toward the same goal. It just, rural communities look different than urban communities, look different than suburban communities. And so absolutely tailoring it to meet the needs of your school district and your community is absolutely, I agree. Yep, absolutely important.
Yeah. I tell people when they ask, there's no copy and paste on this one. You can't look at a neighboring district and use theirs because the resources in your district are not the resources in the other district. And it's all about highlighting the strengths in your district. And Christy, I have it worked out seamlessly now. Thank you. Thanks to Megan at KDE. They're now being posted on the media page under our division, which is Continuous Improvement, the Office of Continuous Improvement. So I will, I don't know that I have time to render it before I go to this monitoring session, but as soon as I get back to the hotel room, I will link it to her and she will get it up and she'll have to do editing from the beginning. That won't take long. So I anticipate it maybe this week, getting it sent out. It'll be up on the media page.
And Zach, I'll send you a PDF of the slides with those live links, because we have a resource on our website that I also is linked in the additional resources that most of this information is from. And so our team put together a document that then I pulled a lot of the best practices from. So I'll make sure that you've got that to send out as well.
Thank you, everyone. And we had a lot of guests from Title I who do consolidated monitoring, and they help out with this, providing technical assistance. So I want to thank everybody from our Title I that made it here today. That was a welcome surprise. And thank you, everybody. I do have to cut it short now so that I can go meet friends at a school district. Karen, thanks for being here. Thank you for everybody at KDE who came to watch. And thank you from everybody across the state who came. Email me if you have any questions, or email Jennifer White. Thank you.